Chemistry begins at a scale we can't see, with atoms, electrons, and the bonds that hold them together. But those small interactions have much larger consequences. The way atoms are bonded determines the structure of a molecule, and that structure helps determine its properties, how it reacts, and how it behaves in the world around us. These relationships are important not only when chemicals are being studied or used, but also when they enter the living systems and the environment. Throughout this presentation, I'll explore how our understanding of chemical bonding and molecular structure has developed, and how that knowledge can be applied to understand both the uses and the impacts of chemicals. One scientist who fundamentally changed our understanding of these relationships was Linus Pauling. He transformed our understanding of chemical bonding. Born in 1901, Pauling became especially interested in a question that was still not completely understood at the time. What actually holds atoms together, and how does that bonding determine the structure of a molecule? His research brought ideas from physics and chemistry together to develop a better understanding of the chemical bond. He made major contributions to our understanding of covalent bonding and the molecular structure, and developed the electronegativity scale that we still use to describe how strongly atoms attract electrons within a bond. His work earned him the 1954 Nobel Prize in Chemistry and helped establish many of the ideas we now use to understand why molecules have the structures and properties that they do. One of the most useful ideas to come from this work is that electrons aren't always shared equally between bonded atoms. This diagram shows how electronegativity difference can be used in practice. As the difference between two atoms increases, the type of bond can range from nonpolar covalent to polar covalent and eventually ionic. The partial charges shown here result from electrons being pulled more strongly toward one atom. This understanding of chemical bonding becomes especially interesting when we look at a molecule like benzene. What makes benzene so interesting is that its structure isn't quite as simple as the alternating single and double bonds that we usually draw. The electrons are actually delocalized across the entire carbon ring. Because of this, the 6 carbon-to-carbon bonds are equivalent rather than behaving as 3 separate single bonds and 3 separate double bonds. This gives benzene an unusual amount of stability, and that stability has a major influence on the reactions it undergoes. Benzene's stability and ability to undergo reactions that produce many different compounds have also made it extremely useful in industrial processes. Today, it is an important starting material for producing things like plastics, resins, and nylon. But understanding benzene's chemistry also means understanding its risks. Benzene is very volatile, so it evaporates easily, and inhalation is an important role of exposure. Once it enters the body, benzene is metabolized into other compounds that can interfere with normal bone marrow function and blood cell production. With long-term exposure, the damage is associated with an increased risk of leukemia, which is why benzene is classified as a known human carcinogen. So benzene is a good example of why we can't look at a chemical only in terms of what it's useful for. Its properties also influence how we're exposed to it and the risks that come with that exposure. Instead of easily breaking apart its electron system through addition reactions, benzene tends to undergo substitution reactions that allow the aromatic ring to remain intact. This relationship between electron arrangement, molecular structure, stability, and reactivity is a really good example of why understanding chemical bonding matters. A structure drawn on paper can actually tell us a lot of how a substance is going to behave. This difference becomes really clear when benzene is compared with a typical alkene. An alkene can undergo an addition reaction, where the pi bond breaks and new atoms are added across the double bond. Benzene, however, behaves differently. With a catalyst like iron 3 bromide, it undergoes substitution instead. One hydrogen is replaced by bromine, while the aromatic ring is preserved. This allows benzene to react without losing the stability provided by its delocalized electrons. Under appropriate conditions, benzene can undergo addition reactions. The important point is, unlike a typical alkene, benzene generally favors substitution because it preserves the aromatic delocalized pi electron system. It's a great example of how molecular structure directly influences chemical reactivity. Understanding why a molecule behaves the way it does is useful in a laboratory, but these same chemical principles become even more important when chemicals enter the environment. Once a substance is released into air, water, or soil, properties like its solubility, stability, concentration, and reactivity can determine where it travels, how long it remains there, and whether it becomes harmful to living organisms. This is where chemistry connects with ecotoxicology, the study of how chemical contaminants affect organisms and ecosystems. Ecotoxicologists apply these ideas to understand not only whether a chemical is harmful, but why, at what concentration, under what conditions, and what happens to it once it enters an ecosystem. An ecotoxicologist's work can take place both in the field and in the laboratory. They may collect samples of water, soil, sediment, or even organisms like fish and mussels, and then analyze those samples to identify pollutants, measure their concentrations, and determine how they may be affecting an ecosystem. To interpret those results, ecotoxicologists need to understand things like molecular structure, bonding, concentration, solubility, pH, and chemical reactions, because all of these can influence how a pollutant behaves once it's in the environment. They may work with heavy metals, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, road salts, and organic pollutants, so safe handling, proper disposal, and WMS are also crucial. Becoming an ecotoxicologist usually begins with a bachelor's degree in areas such as chemistry, environmental science, or toxicology, with a graduate education often required for more advanced research positions. Chemistry courses are an important part of that training because understanding the effects of the pollutant really starts with understanding the chemical itself. This circles back to the main idea. Knowing a molecule's structure and properties can help us predict not only how it reacts in a laboratory, but what might happen when that same chemistry enters an ecosystem. This brings us to benzo-pyrene, or BAP, where a lot of the chemistry we've already looked at starts to come together. BAP is a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon with the formula C20H12. If its structure looks somewhat familiar, that's because it contains the same kind of aromatic carbon rings we've already seen with benzene. But here, 5 rings are fused together into a much larger molecule. Unlike benzene, BAP isn't mainly important because we intentionally manufacture and use it. It's a pollutant that forms during incomplete combustion, which is when carbon-containing materials like fossil fuels, wood, or tobacco don't burn completely. It can be released through things like vehicle exhaust, industrial processes, and smoke. And its larger molecule structure gives it some very different properties from benzene. BAP is much less volatile and extremely poorly soluble in water. Instead, it tends to attach to particles and organic matter. This becomes really important when we look at what happens to BAP after it's released into the environment. After benzo-pyrene is released into the atmosphere, it tends to attach to small airborne particles, which can eventually settle onto land or into water. Once it reaches an aquatic environment, BAP doesn't dissolve easily. Instead, it tends to bind to particles and organic matter, which can eventually collect in sediment and create long-term exposure for aquatic organisms. BAP can be toxic to fish, invertebrates, and algae, but something I found particularly interesting is that its toxicity can actually change depending on environmental conditions. In one study, fathead minnows exposed to BAP and UV radiation experienced 50% mortality within 40 hours, while the same concentration without UV wasn't toxic after 96 hours. The health effects of benzo-pyrene depend on the amount and duration of exposure. Short-term or higher exposures may cause effects such as irritation, although evidence for acute effects in humans is much more limited than what we know about long-term exposure. The greater concern with BAP is its long-term carcinogenic effect. Interestingly, some of the damage occurs after BAP enters the body and is metabolized. During this process, the body can produce a highly reactive metabolites, including BPDE. BPDE can form covalent bonds with DNA, creating DNA adducts. If that damage isn't repaired correctly, mutations can remain and eventually contribute to the development of cancer. Because of these risks, reducing exposure starts with reducing BAP at its source. Cleaner combustion and industrial emission controls can limit how much is released, while environmental monitoring and Canadian guidelines can help identify and manage exposure. When contamination has already occurred, methods such as activated carbon treatment and remediation of contaminated soil or sediment can help address it. Overall, BAP shows why managing a pollutant involves more than knowing that it's toxic. We need to understand where it comes from, where it goes, how organisms are exposed, and what happens once it enters the body. That understanding gives us ways to both prevent new pollution and reduce the effects of contamination that's already there. Overall, these examples show why understanding chemistry matters beyond the classroom. Pauling's work helps explain how chemical bonding influences molecular structure, while benzene and BAP show how structure can influence a chemical's behavior and effects. Ecotoxicologists apply this chemistry to understand how pollutants move through the environment, affect organisms, and how those impacts can be reduced. Together, this connects what happens at the molecular level to what happens in the world around us. Thank you.